G'day all, I'm Keith from Lovelace Academy. Now, I'm going to be trying to make sense of blockchain here. So in the first episode, I went through and explained why Cardano was so special and different to all the other blockchains. But my friends and family didn't even know what blockchain was. So here's my attempt at trying to make sense of it. Now, heads up, I'm going to be trying to jam an entire semester's worth of content here. So I cannot possibly try to fit it all in half an hour, so I'll provide all the supplementary links to other material in the description below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, so what are the goals? So first of all, I want to talk about what blockchain is, and more importantly, why will it profoundly change the world? And when I talk about blockchains, I'm going to be talking about public and permissionless blockchains. So these two attributes, I believe, would give the true value and unlock the potential of this blockchain technology. Now, where did it all start? So the idea of public permissionless blockchains came from Satoshi Nakamoto back in 2008. So this was the paper which really started it all. And the first block was minted in 2009. And embedded within that first Genesis block is this message. The Times, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. Now we'll talk about the significance of that later. But in terms of Bitcoin, now where does all this value come from? I mean, it's overall, as an asset, it's over $1 trillion. So there are four main points that really give it value. So first of all, it's the fact that it's a distributed data structure. I mean, this isn't too complicated here, but it's the cryptography around it which makes things very interesting. Next up is a protocol of trust, especially without a central authority. Now, this is a very important point here. And lastly, and third point is the fact that it's an open network. So it's a network of both the miners and the participants of the blockchain network. And finally, it's an infrastructure for sound money. So a lot of thought has been put into it to make it pretty much the ideal form of money as it is today. Okay, so if blockchain's the answer, we must first address the question. So the most important question you have here is, can you have a globally open, trusted, and resilient financial system without a central intermediary? So I'm going to be highlighting these points here before I dive further in. Okay, so the most difficult thing here, I mean, this is quite a difficult question as it stands, but if you combine the openness with the final point without a central intermediary, so this is also known, as everyone would recognize, decentralization. So if you combine both of these points, this truly makes it a very complex problem. All right, now let's try to visually summarize what blockchain is. So as you can see, what you have here is an immutable, ordered, and time-stamped log. So another word for that, really, we're covering this multiple times, is a ledger. Now, there can be different types of entries within this ledger. So you can have idea of a transaction-based ledger or balance-based ledger. So one prime example of a transaction-based ledger is one which Bitcoin uses. It's called the UTXO model. And then for the balance-based ledger, you have the accounts model, which is used by Ethereum. And finally, you can have something which is kind of like the best of both worlds, and that's represented by the extended UTXO model used by Cardano. Now, each of these entries are kind of this irreversible and uncensorable entity that will be recorded and cannot be changed. Now, let's try and visualize. So essentially, multiple items of these say for example transactions, will be grouped together in what's known as a block, and this is where the block in blockchain comes from. And each of these blocks really refer back to a previous block. And this is the chain part. Really. This is the chain part of the blockchain. A better description or visual representation is something from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So you can see this is what the blockchain kind of looks like. So every block here refers back via this link to the previous block. Now let's get to the cryptography. So we have two main cryptographic primitives, hash functions and asymmetric cryptography. So let's start with hash functions. So hashes, so they provide a unique fingerprint for any type of data that goes into it. And the final output of a hash function is something that is of a fixed length. So you can put in a terabyte file, you can put in an empty file, or something with, just contains some images of cats. So the final thing is really just a fixed thing. So the idea is that you have a unique thumbprint for any data that you can pass into it. Now, what does that mean? So it means that you can't tamper with any of the values, as it provides a different output. Now this all links back to the idea of trust. Now let's go back to this thing. So every entry, really, every transaction in this block would also have a signature. Now, a signature is a result of using asymmetric cryptography or public key cryptography, as we mentioned. So it provides ownership and consent around everything that's recorded on the blockchain. Now, these signatures are stored and verified for every single transaction. And that's that. So now, one important thing to note is that these cryptographic values that are captured for every single transaction and for the block itself are verified across the entire network. Now, this seems a bit wasteful, but really this allows us to achieve trust in what you call a trustless environment. So the idea is that this is actually a feature which allows us to all reach a conclusion, the final state of the blockchain, and it protects all of us really at the end of the day. Now let's deal with the open point. So we want a globally open financial system. So Bitcoin and all the other blockchains that came after that are public and permissionless is open to anyone in the world. So as long as you have the keys to an address, you can sign and submit a new transaction. Now this can be a payment of 10 ADA in this case, to pay for dinner, right? Just use as payment. Or, this can be a deposit of 10,000 HUSD. So another kind of asset that's recorded on this blockchain into some kind of DeFi smart contract so that you can accumulate interest. And finally, in the case of Cardano, you can even vote. You can vote on the future of the blockchain itself. So you can modify what various protocol parameters and internal functions of the blockchain through a voting mechanism that's also recorded on this blockchain. So this is what it means to be open. Now, combining this openness and the trust, we have to segue into a very important point. It revolves around consensus. So that is, how does an open, decentralized network of nodes agree on the current state of the blockchain? Now, the idea is that new blocks can only be added by proving something that requires some effort, time, ownership, or just general skin in the game. Now, combined with the previously mentioned cryptography, it makes it something that can be verified by absolutely everyone in this network. So in summary, it's something that is hard to prove and easy to verify. So this essentially stops all the bad actors from spamming the network with fake blocks and helps us agree on what is current. Now, how do we make it grow? So this is where the incentivized bits, so this is where Satoshi Nakamoto really kind of made it unique. So you've kind of incentivized this consensus approach, which means that everyone now has some kind of financial incentive to help out. And this is another approach that helps the network grow. Now, in the case of Cardano, staking is another one of these financial incentives. So the equivalent of miners in Cardano are the stake pools, and they're incentivized as they produce blocks by getting ADA. And on top of that, this whole incentivized network is spread to the entire Cardano network of anyone who has ADA can also get interest by staking with one of these stake pools. Okay, so let's get to the topic of resiliency. So this ledger is replicated across the entire network. And this means that the exact copy is shown across every single node that participates in this network. Now, let's have a look at what would happen. Say, for example, these two nodes on the right, say they were part of some autocratic government which decided to cut off all internet access of those two nodes to the outside world. Now, this is effectively seems like a disaster in your typical kind of distributed systems design. But in this case, the three existing nodes can still communicate and still establish consensus, even though the two nodes are totally unavailable. Now, this allows the network to keep functioning as long as there are nodes that are able to replicate and establish the consensus. This network will still be alive. Okay, now let's get to the why. So why is blockchain such a revolutionary concept? So we've talked about what it is just then, but why? So why do I think it's such a revolutionary idea? So here I'll talk about the current systems that play a really important part in our lives and how blockchain can complement and address a lot of these issues that exist in those two major parts. So the first part really is the internet and its layers. So we can't talk about blockchain without talking about the technology that it's built on top of. So we all know the internet is this groundbreaking open platform. And then secondly, I'll be talking about money, banking, and the financial markets. So, okay, let's start with the internet. I'm going to be zooming in. Okay, so this beautiful diagram here kind of shows a very high level kind of map of the internet. So what it is really just a network of networks. So it's a global network which allows any device connectivity to any other device that's connected to it through the allocation of unique addresses. So what you see in this kind of zoomed in bottom right bit. So each of those are a unique address across the entire internet. And the other thing the internet provides is the ability to route the data from one point, so one address, to another. So you can theoretically be here and you can send data that can reach all the way to the other side of this network. Okay, so the important thing here is that the internet is really just a base layer. So it's maintained by multiple organizations and bodies around the world, and there's no single owner. And the other thing is that on top of it are layers of protocols which govern the rules in which data can be communicated between these devices. Now, so this is where the layered architecture comes into being. Now, although the internet's fundamentally changed the way the world works, the things that are built on top of that, platforms and services, which don't quite operate in the same kind of open, transparent way. So I'm going to be moving across to platforms and services. So here's the current landscape. So effectively, on top of the internet are all these platforms and services. So for example, if I want to send someone a message, chances are I'll be going through the Facebook platform, either through Facebook Messenger, Instagram, or WhatsApp. So although the internet technically allows us to have this direct point-to-point connection between any two devices, we're actually going through an intermediary here, which is Facebook. So Facebook really, we have no idea what's going on behind the millions of servers that reside in the Facebook data centers. So let's talk about the openness, the trusted, and resiliency. So the same points that I talked about with blockchain, can we apply that to these platforms and services? So unfortunately, although anyone can create accounts on Facebook, it's not truly an open network, because you can easily be banned without any kind of justification. You can be deplatformed. And on the topic of ownership, you don't really own the data here. So everything kind of just resides behind Facebook's big, giant wall. And now moving on, we all know that these platforms and services don't really have the same level of openness and trust that we really expect. Now, moving back to blockchain, so we know that we realistically can't uproot all these existing systems and decentralize everything, right? So the idea is that we have to complement what's currently here already, the Facebooks and the Airbnbs, etc. And we want to build the better ones and allow people to opt out of these existing platforms. And obviously, with blockchain, the idea is that it provides a very efficient payment system on top of everything that's on top of the internet. So that's the very first obvious candidate. There's also another major thing around digital identity. That's what I kind of wanted to describe in this diagram here, but I don't think I have time to go through that. So that can be another video in the future. Okay. Next up, let's talk about money, our favorite topic. So, money is really at core fundamental level, is just an abstract social construct. So what do I mean by that? So ultimately, it's really the trust and confidence that we place on the value of something. That something can be the Olympic medal tally, the gold, silver, and bronzes, the hard assets that's been there since the start of time. But also the new inventions that really came about over the last couple of 100 years. So this concept of fiat currency, and finally, cryptocurrency, we can also define it as money. Now, the important thing is there are properties of sound money. So these 5 points here, transferable, durable, fungible, divisible, and scarce. Now, just always put into mind, these 5 properties of money. And relate back to what we're talking about. Okay, now let's talk about the banking system. So the banking system is where the fiat currency that we use day to day kind of flows through. So at the heart of it, you have the central bank. So this is where, for example, US dollars, this is where it's minted, really, at the start of this banking journey. So you have, as you would expect, a ledger that's used to record, all the flow of the fiat currency from the central banks through trusted through trusted channels to the commercial banks, which, as you would also expect, hold their own ledger, their sub-ledger of sorts. So you have a master ledger that's being maintained by the central bank, as well as the sub-ledger that's maintained by all the other kind of commercial banks and other banks really that receive and flow the fiat currency through. Okay, so this central bank has a lot of responsibilities, as you would expect. Now, a good set of responsibilities that a central bank would provide is obviously to maintain that supply and record of the fiat currency. It's also there to establish monetary policies. And then there's also, a lot of the regulatory aspects to regulate and supervise banking system, manage a safe and efficient payment system, as well as be the banker to the government. So, this is what a good central bank is supposed to look like. So it's like an independent entity which makes sure that the economies that it's looking after is stable and prosperous at the same time. Now, one important thing to note, though, is if you look at the system, this modern banking system, is it truly open, trusted, and resilient? This is what I'll be kind of touching on from now on. So let's have a look at the monetary policy. So, typically you want to have a bit of inflation. You want to stimulate the economy. You're tweaking these rates and so on. But you can also have out of control policies where you end up just printing money, just for the sake of it, right? And this is what we've seen very recently, as you can tell here. The money printer gabur. So this is pretty much this kind of hockey stick-like graph where the current this is the M1 supply, is sitting at about almost $20 trillion. So you can see that, COVID was not a pleasant period and things had to be done, but this is unfortunately what we have to deal with. Okay, let's move on to the financial markets. So the idea is that, investors here on the top left, they want to make a return on their money, right? So you've seen the diagram that I had previously. Now the money somehow makes its way to the investors, and they basically want to diversify or even speculate across many different types of assets, and these are very, very large market cap kind of asset groups. So at the lower end of the scale, you can see, for example, physical assets. You have gold, which is sitting at about $7 trillion currently. So this is already 7 times as large as Bitcoin. But one thing to note is that there are many other physical assets that you can speculate on across these markets. So gold is really just the tip of the iceberg there. If you have a look at derivatives, for example, the total notional value of derivatives alone is sitting at about 500 trillion. Now, where does blockchain even come into this picture? So blockchain, on top of being that store of value that that gold can provide, but even a more modern, sound version of it, you also have the ability through smart contracts to pretty much disrupt this entire section here. Obviously, the physical assets as well. So we know that blockchain is still in this kind of infancy. And looking at the financial markets, you also have the idea, going back to the openness, is it trusted and is it resilient? So, we know from experience, these things are not exactly there. Okay, on to crisis. So the not so good things with the current system. Let's have a look at what happened, back in 2015 with the Greek debt crisis. So you have a lot of money that you've saved up, you're sitting in a bank somewhere, but all of a sudden you realize you can't take it out, right? And the banks are basically not allowing you to not just withdraw it from ATMs, but to transfer it out of the country or anything. So this is what we call capital control. So it's obviously happened in Greece, it's happened in Lebanon, it's still happening right now, and obviously Argentina is also not in good shape around that. So essentially, whatever money that you think that you own sitting in the bank account is not really yours to spend. And what's worse is that during these crises, you also have inflation kind of running rampant in the background. So let's talk about inflation. So inflation is one of these core aspects of fiat currency. When it goes out of control, is what actually leaves much of the world in poverty. So you have billions of people that are literally stuck in the state of poverty purely because of inflation. Now, this is the kind of, say, a leaderboard of sorts of inflation that's going around the world. I'm doing it based on Hankey's inflation dashboard. So he's got his own kind of metrics which measures real inflation. As you can see, topping the list, you have Venezuela pretty much smashing through with the hyperinflation rate of the 2,600%. This is what I want to look at. So imagine, you have money that's sitting there that you've spent your entire life saving up, but then a year later, it's basically been inflated, where it's just worth nothing anymore, right? It's also happening right now in Turkey at a lesser level compared to what we see here in the top 12, and also India. So the idea is that, because of COVID and all the tough measures, you're starting to see a massive increase in the price of food and daily living. So, because most of the people end up spending a vast majority of their savings or their income into food and oil and petrol and so on, the bare essentials, they no longer have the money to actually grow their wealth. Okay, and crisis after crisis. So you can probably tell by the title, subprime mortgage crisis. I'll be talking about the global financial crisis. So this is kind of the state of events that really kind of flow through the different financial markets all the way through to the government body, and ultimately leading to the end result here, right? So there were actions that had to be taken by the central bank and other various bodies around it, but ultimately we had bailouts, right? So rather than all these big banks that were speculating on a lot of people's hard-earned money and causing the crisis in the first place, they were not really punished, but they were actually bailed out with with the taxpayers' money. So this is where we want to talk about this headline, where the Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. Now, does this look familiar? Let's go back to square one. This is going to take some time for me to go back up, but where we're going to go back to square one, once this lets me, to the very first block that was minted on the Bitcoin network in 2009. So going back, the Times, 3rd of Jan in 2009, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. So this ties in pretty much directly back to why Bitcoin was invented in the first place. So, we've talked about internet, we've talked about money, but Bitcoin was the first successful attempt to combine the best attributes of both of these to give birth to modern blockchain technology, while also addressing a lot of the systematic issues that cause these crises in the first place. So just rewinding again, so what it is an open, trusted, and resilient system that's based on the principles of sound money. Now, this isn't a silver bullet, as you might expect. There's still a lot of potential issues here, so let's just highlight the current challenges. So blockchain technology, as awesome as it is, you still have to deal with the issue of scalability. So how do we get to the global system level where you're supporting thousands upon thousands of transactions per second? So for example, like Visa, they do something like 24,000 transactions per second, whereas Bitcoin is still literally stuck at 7 per second. Ethereum is not doing that much better. I think it's about 14 or 15. So scalability is the first challenge. You also have the cost of the fees. So for those that have used or are using these smart contracts platforms, they have to deal with pretty much exorbitant fees when you want to just perform a very simple operation with a smart contract. And lastly, challenges of centralization. So even though the technology was supposed to revolve around decentralization, you have a lot of centralization of many key facets of the blockchain technology. So for example, in mining, for example, you have, I think, about 65% or more of the mining power all residing in one single geographic area. Now, as you can tell, that's not ideal. If for some reason the country that the vast majority of the mining power is in decide to confiscate, it has the power to do so, then the entire network is going to be in shambles. It's not an easy repercussion there. Now, let's go to Cardano. Okay. So where does Cardano fit into it? So I'm going to be trying to highlight this now. Bring it back into the picture. All right. So I've already talked about how it's built on top of the strongest foundations. So it's based on very proven scientific research. So with Bitcoin, obviously, it was genius in the way it came out, but a lot of it was like some person or group of people's heuristics as to what they think a system should be. Whereas Cardano took it to the next level, where they really wanted to put a lot of scientific vigor into coming up with the best system possible. And the other thing is it's built for the future. So it's got the governance built in. You've got the treasury and on-chain voting, which allows us to have that really, that pure decentralized approach to having, deciding on the future of the blockchain network itself. And as you would expect, it also has that all-star team, the leadership, and this amazing team of developers, product owners, designers, etc. underneath that, as well as an amazing community, all united by a vision of a fairer world. So we've talked about the challenges, but Cardano is actually there to address these main challenges. So going back to the topic of real decentralization, if you've seen the map of all the current stake pools out there and all the participants, is also very distributed around the world. You don't have a very centralized source of consensus power there. It's also got the predictability with the predictable and low fees. So it comes from its kind of accounting model, the extended UTXO model. I can touch on that later as well. And finally, on the scalability side, it's thought really long and hard, with this concept of sidechains, of having a computation layer there. So all of this will be addressed by Cardano, and this is why, I hope you understand where I'm getting at. So blockchain is a fundamentally life-changing bit of technology. You have some big platforms that started the way, like Bitcoin and Ethereum, but you have to let the system evolve, and this is where Cardano comes in. Okay, thank you, and thank you all.